Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Some Alaska Native leaders are pushing back against the Trump administration's newest pressure to open up the Tongas National Forest to more logging. It's the second time the president has removed protections under what's known as the roadless rule, which has major implications for the largest stand of old-growth timber in the country. It's in conjunction with his call to greatly increase timber harvests on all federal land. We'll hear more coming up after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Studies show microplastics can be found throughout our ecosystem, and plastic pollution disproportionately impacts indigenous communities. So scientists at Alaska Pacific University in Anchorage are studying how these tiny particles of plastic move through Alaska water. And they're developing the first in-state lab accredited to test water samples for microplastics. Alaska Public Media's Rachel Cassandra reports.
Nike McCampbell pulls on her diving dry suit and walks to the edge of the water at Smitty's Cove in Whittier. She dives below the surface. McCampbell will travel underwater about 80 yards from shore to collect water samples. She says they're studying how microplastics are transported through ocean currents.
And we're going to see where microplastics are moving.
She's part of a new team at Alaska Pacific University. Last year, the APU team got a $5 million grant from NASA to study microplastics in Alaska. Microplastics have already been found in the most remote corners of the state. So APU's research aims to expand that understanding by looking at how microplastics enter all water sources, including oceans and rain. Kian Muldoon is a graduate student on the research team. He says the ultimate goal of their work is to help reduce the harmful health effects of microplastics.
Hopefully using that research to inform cleanup efforts or to try to mitigate harm.
Back at the APU lab, Muldoon and his colleagues can use new specialized equipment to help identify various microplastics in the samples. The team has already collected samples from the summit of Denali, the Eklutna Lake watershed, and Prince William Sound. That's according to Dr. Dee Barker, a chemist and head of the research team. She says with new instruments funded by the grant, the team can identify particles small enough to likely pass through human tissues, and they can study the chemistry behind the microplastics they find.
The chemistry of that particle, how does that interact with the chemistry of a human being?
She says that understanding is missing from much of existing microplastics research. Ultimately, Barker says they aim to get their lab accredited for microplastics testing. That would allow Alaska communities to send in water samples to test for microplastics. Barker says testing water sources is the first step in understanding how communities could protect themselves from the tiny plastic particles. In Whittier, I'm Rachel Cassandra.
Native Americans are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease or other dementias than white or Asian Americans. And because tribal members are already at risk of being murdered or going missing, it means having culturally sensitive resources when elders stray from home, as KJZZ's Gabriel Pietrorazio reports.
Megan Dickin is from the United Homa Nation in Louisiana and with the nonprofit International Association for Indigenous Aging. She recently presented a new toolkit which aims to help when Native elders wander.
It's very customizable, and so every community can utilize it in a way that suits them, and we encourage that.
Dickin says tribal police departments are often the first responders.
But a lot of times law enforcement is stretched thin. They don't have enough officers, or they don't have enough resources, or they have other crimes happening. So it can aid in community policing.
Her group says 80% of people with dementia will wander from home multiple times, while 90% may die if they are not found within 24 hours.
When they pass on, a lot of times that knowledge disappears. And we certainly don't want that to die with them prematurely because they went wandering and were not found in time.
For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrorazio.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by Drummond Woodsum, a full-service law firm whose nationally recognized tribal nations practice provides services to tribal nations and their enterprises and to companies that do business with tribes across the country. More at dwmlaw.com.
Minutes from downtown Anchorage, the Alaska Native Heritage Center is more than a museum. It's where Alaska Native traditions, languages, and arts come alive. There's always something new at the Alaska Native Heritage Center who support this show. More at alaskanative.net.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The Trump administration wants to open up road construction and expanded timber harvesting for nearly 50 million acres of federal Forest Service land. For the second time, the president rescinded the Ag Department's quarter-century-old directive known as the Roadless Rule that bans logging, mining, and other development on U.S. forest land. Perhaps nowhere else is the rule more pivotal than in Alaska's Tongas National Forest, the country's largest national forest and the largest stand of old-growth timber. Republican Representative Nick Begich of Alaska says the roadless rule blocks critical economic opportunity. But some Alaska Native tribal leaders with cultural ties to the Tongass are challenging the rescission, saying more logging in one of the world's largest temperate rainforests will forever harm an irreplaceable ecological treasure. Today we'll talk with leaders from the Tongass about these protections, and you can join us. Call us at 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Our first guest joins us now from Oregon, Chuck Sams. He is the Director of Indigenous Programs at the Yale Center for Environmental Justice and the former Director of the U.S. National Park Service. He is Cayuse and Walla Walla. Good morning, Chuck, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Good morning, Sean. It's nice to hear from you.
Absolutely. Well, start us off here. What's been the impact of the roadless road rule on U.S. forest land over the last 25 years?
You know, I was a young man starting out my career in salmon and watershed restoration with my tribe here, the Confederate Tribe Umatilla, and along with my cousins at the Yakima Nation and Warm Springs and Nez Perce. And I was part of the whole conversation in the 90s. Over 600 public meetings were held. 1.6 million public comments came in about the roadless rule. 95% were supporting the roadless rule area protection, and eventually it would cover 39 states when it went into effect in 2001 and protected 58 million acres of national forest lands. And, you know, and it was for exceptional recreation, wildlife and fish habitat, clean water, and ecosystem services that protected for all Americans. But for us as Native people, it really protected our rights to our usual accustomed places and our treaty rights to these places that were held in common by citizens of the United States. President Bush in 2005 tried to overturn the rule, and he lost in the courts. So this is quite surprising to me that once again we have an administration that wants to open up for over 45 million acres of land once again.
Now, the elimination of the roadless rule, what would this mean for your tribe and other tribes in Oregon?
You know, it would end up being more roads. I don't think maybe the American public doesn't fully understand. U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service already has over 370,000 miles road system. That's twice as long as the nation's highway system, crisscrossing our forests as it is. And as we know, when we look at data, fires are more likely to start near roads than they are in the backcountry. And so, you know, you put in more roads, we may end up with more fires. I think it counters their current argument. But in addition to that, we will see, you know, degradation of these areas and habitat of threatened species, whether that's the California condor or the grizzly bear and wolves at Yellowstone, native salmon here and trout in the Pacific Northwest, migratory songbirds along the Appalachian hardwoods, and so many more all throughout, and especially in Alaska, where we have some of the still most pristine areas that support multiple wildlife.
Chuck, who benefits from having this rule rescinded?
You know, the logging companies and timber companies, once again. And I'll point out that, post-World War II, when tribes were terminated, it was those same companies that really benefited from termination of tribes. Here in my own home state of Oregon, the Klamath tribe lost 2 million acres of land, which was prime timberland. Of course, we know the Menominee lost over 3 million acres of prime timberland. Tribes throughout the United States ended up foregoing over 50 million acres of timberland that got sold to timber companies in the 1950s and 60s during the termination period. To me, this is just another termination period. By terminating the roadless rule, you're just opening up those lands for timber harvest and potential development for other recreational facilities and or housing.
Now, the logging industry, potentially jobs in rural areas, building materials for homes and other structures. Couldn't this be an economic boost for some places that need it?
It could be. I'm not going to say that could be true, but how do we balance that with some of our needs? Over the last 25 years, we've been able to protect large sources of municipal water supplies for the nation that have served over 60 million Americans in over 3,400 communities in 33 states, because we've been able to reduce the pollution that was caused in our water supply through this. So, you're balancing what we really need as human beings, cold, clean water, with jobs. And I'm not sure that that's really a great trade-off right now.
Chuck, you mentioned that this is the second time that there's been an attempt to rescind the rule. How successful do you think this one will be?
I'm not quite sure. You have a Congress that is bending its will to the current administration and to the president. You have courts that seem to be favoring this administration. I think we have some strong concern that they're maybe ignoring the will of the people. As I said, 25 plus years ago, 95% of the comments were in support of this rule. And I think if 25 years forward, we've seen the benefits of this rule being in place. We've seen the ability for us not only of protecting water sources, but we've also been able to protect over 11,300 climbing routes and more than 1,000 whitewater paddling runs. You have over 43,000 miles of trail, 23,000 miles of mountain bike trail, and large sections of the Continental Divide and Pacific Crest and Appalachian National Trails traverse protected roadless areas. I mean, these are areas that are being used by all citizens of the United States, that we hold these lands in common. And when you do this, it goes into private ownership. It bars us from Americans to these lands that we've set aside for ourselves that we should be using in common.
And Chuck, how did that work previously then? I mean, you just described the bike trails and some of the other services that have been made possible. How was the National Park Service able to collaborate with the U.S. Forest Service to enforce this roadless rule for so many years?
Oh, we worked very closely. The former Chief Moore of the U.S. Forest Service, when I was in office, was a great partner to work with over at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We made sure that the connectivity that we had on the Continental Divide, on the Pacific Crest Trail, along the Appalachian Trail that ran between national forests and our national parks, whether that was on the Blue Ridge Parkway, on the eastern seaboard, or out here along Crater Lake, those trails were maintained and built so that the American public could get out there and access these recreation areas. And because the roadless rule was, fully in effect, it allowed for folks to be able to enjoy these spaces without being interrupted by vehicles and, logging industry and other issues around it. And I think that was a good thing. And you still ended up with strong economies. I will point out that because of the recreation economies, both for the Forest Service, but particularly for the National Park Service, we were showing nearly a 15-to-1 advantage. For every dollar that was invested in the National Park Service, there was a $15 return. When you start doing this and closing down these trails and these recreational areas, these gateway communities will start losing money also.
All right, Chuck, thank you for joining the show today. 1-800-99-NATIVE is the number to join the conversation. The Tongas National Forest in southeast Alaska is the largest U.S. national forest at 16.7 million acres, and it expands larger than 10 U.S. states. Give us a call if you're familiar with the Tongas and you understand the issue we're talking about today, or you have insights to offer. 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's talk now with Cody Desitel. He joins us from the Colville Reservation. He is president of the Intertribal Timber Council and the executive director and a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Cody, good morning. You've been on the show before. Welcome back.
Good morning, Sean. Good to be back.
It's good to have you. Now, the Intertribal Timber Council has not taken an official position, but how does rescinding the roadless rule affect tribal logging interests? We talked about it a little bit with Chuck.
So I think for tribal logging interest, it doesn't impact us much because most of the timber that comes from Indian country comes from on-reservation resources. However, with expanded authorities that we've seen in recent years, like expansion of the Good Neighbor Authority to tribes, and expansion of 638 contracting authority to Tribal Forest Protection Act proposals, it could potentially have impacts in the future, but we don't quite know what that is yet.
Now, how has the roadless rule affected commercial and other logging interests over just these past 2 decades like we've been talking about?
Well, I think generally, I think the roadless rule is just one of the contributing factors, but if we look at industry that exists across the nation, it's dwindled significantly, particularly in the West. So what that's meant for tribes is in many parts of the country, there aren't mills available, isn't infrastructure available, so they really don't have any value for those forest products that they would harvest as part of the tribal forest management plans. So it's made it very difficult for them to manage both their forests and their fuels, so that what we've tended to see, particularly in the West again, is that we've seen significant increases in wildfires, and those wildfires seem to be more and more destructive.
All right, we're going to take a short break. We'll come back. We'll continue our conversation with Cody Desitel. We also have some other guests on the line as well. We'll talk with them. And of course, we have the phone lines open for listeners who would like to join today's conversation. The current administration wants to open up road construction and expand timber harvesting for nearly 50 million acres of federal Forest Service land. What do you think about that? Give us a call. We want to hear all perspectives, all insights. 1-800-99-NATIVE. We've got the phone lines open and we're waiting for you to call. An art exhibition in St. Paul, Minnesota blends traditional Native American arts with LGBTQ2+ activism and imagery. The artists see it as a way to both express themselves and reconnect with a decolonized narrative of Two-Spirit identity. We'll hear from the artists and organizers on the next Native America Calling.
Support provided by Amerind. Amerind is 100% tribally owned and partners with tribes and their businesses to provide affordable commercial insurance coverage, protect tribal sovereignty, and strengthen Native American communities by helping to keep dollars in Indian country. Information about property, liability, commercial auto, and workers' comp available at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We are speaking with tribal leaders and others about efforts to remove protections against road construction and timber harvesting on millions of acres of U.S. Forest Service lands, such as the Tongas National Forest. What comments or questions do you have about the removal of these protections? You can join us by calling 1-800-996-2848. 1-800-996-2848. And a reminder, you can listen back to this show and past shows on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And you can listen to this and other Native programs by downloading the NV1 app. Check it out. Let's now continue our conversation with Cody Desitel. He is president of the Intertribal Timber Council. And Cody, you mentioned before break the risk of fire with large old growth tree stands like what occur in the Tongas, and this argument that wildfires are mostly the result of human interaction. So by that extension, more roads equal more wildfires. Is that a sound argument?
If you look at the statistics, yes, that people are responsible for the vast majority of the ignitions. But I would also preface that by saying that in places where you're seeing wildfire, because much of the West is fire-adapted ecosystems, that the places that have lower severities, lesser impacts from wildfires tend to be in Indian country, where tribes are doing a great job managing their own landscapes.
Okay. Now, the current administration, how is it benefiting the timber industry in general? What can you tell us about how current policies and efforts from the administration are moving in the direction towards promoting timber logging interests?
Well, I think just making more public lands available would increase the volume that should be produced. Well, in addition to like rescinding the roadless rule, they've also had targets for increased production from Forest Service land in particular, and a significant increase, which presumably should increase the amount of milling capacity. But again, those are going to have to be long-term commitments, because the investments needed to invest in infrastructure is huge these days. I mean, a new mill would probably cost you $100 million to build. So in places where that doesn't exist, it will take, I would think, at least 10 and probably 20-year commitments before you start to see private industry come in to make those investments. So even rescinding the rule, I'm not sure how much change that will make in the short term.
Okay. And in addition to the lack of infrastructure, what other challenges or even regulations are tribes and other logging interests facing when it comes to just having a thriving timber industry?
So I think the timber industry, and in the Northwest anyways, those are largely large industrial private landowners. What they're trying to achieve is much different than what tribes are trying to achieve. So at Colville, in our forest management plan, we have a target for timber harvest volumes, but those are set based on what our ecologic goals are in our forest management plan. So I always use the analogy that when we log, it's intended to improve forest health, reduce fire risk, and improve water quality, carbon inventories, and big game habitat. And really the logs and revenue that we generate for that are just a byproduct of trying to achieve those other things. So I think when you talk about tribal management, that looks much different than, say, a Weyerhaeuser or one of the large industrial owners that are primarily focused on generating revenue and short returns and reducing risk.
All right, Cody, thank you for joining the show. Appreciate your insights. Phone lines open, 1-800-996-2848 for any interested listeners who would like to join our conversation. Just pick up your phone, give us a call, 1-800-996-2848. Maybe you're in Alaska, maybe you're in Southeast Alaska, maybe you are near the Tongas National Forest or another forest in any part of the United States, and you have concerns with logging interests or how environmental concerns are balanced alongside commercial interests, you can give us a call. You can share that take live on the air here at Native America Calling, 1-800-99-NATIVE. Our next guest, Mike Jones, joins us from Kassan, Alaska, where he is the president of the Organized Village of Kassan. President Jones, good morning and welcome to Native America Calling. It's great to have you on the show today.
Night Law, good morning. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, how do you think repealing the protections we're talking about today impacts the Tongas National Forest?
Well, the impacts are local and global. Locally, it's the our old growth forests, our old red cedars. We've been here. We're the Haida. We've been here since before those trees even got here. Our oral traditions include the time of the first trees coming up this way after the Ice Age. So we've been stewarding these lands ever since then, since before that. But The Tongas is known as it's the northern lung of the planet. Everybody knows about the Amazon, but very few people know about the Tongas. It's the largest temperate rainforest in the world, and they're coming after it. And with that, it's our salmon as well, because you can't have healthy salmon runs without healthy forests. They feed off each other. So, yeah, we don't want to see it rescinded. We want to hang on to our trees, especially what's left of our old growth. I live on the island of, it's known English as Prince of Wales Island. To us, it is Keithfly, Old Island. And 90% of our island has been logged. Most of our old growth is gone. And to go after the rest of it to support some logging industry for a very short amount of time in the grand scale of things, where they're just going to keep going until the very last red cedar is gone. And we have to protect that. We have to protect it for ourselves and for the planet.
Mm-hmm. Now, the USDA is undergoing a mandatory 21-day public comment period with regard to the roadless rule. What do you intend to tell lawmakers and administration officials?
Well, a lot of what I just told you. And, one of the reasons their excuses they're using is forest fires, and we don't have forest fires up here. We haven't had a major forest fire up here in southeast Alaska in the Tongas that I'm aware of. In fact, I think we had some of our relatives to the south that used to practice cultural burning to avoid large-scale forest fires, and that was taken away by the Forest Service. So it's kind of a turnaround. We want to hang on our forest. It's very important to us. It's our homeland, on top of everything else, and we're going to protect our homeland.
Can you tell us what type of logging operations are going around right now in the Tongas?
Well, right now, I know of a helicopter timber sale that's going on this island, and it was 70 acres, but they're using a categorical exclusion, a CE, that was used in the Tennessee Basin or the Tennessee Valley. And they're using that study to make it okay to increase the logging from 70 acres to 125 acres. So we're strongly opposing that one. And from what I hear, the Forest Service, their plan is to overwhelm us. So we're really trying to stay ahead of these things and not allow ourselves to be overwhelmed.
How much support? How much support is there from other Southeast tribal governments and also the Sealaska Corporation to halt logging?
Well, I think we're all getting together on this. We talk to each other. We're getting together for a tribal leader summit here in less than a month. But it's the tribal leaders and the environmental organizations that are going to have to come together and fight this.
Okay, thank you, President Jones. Let's hear from another tribal leader in Alaska, Joel Jackson, who joins us now from Cake, Alaska, where he is the president of the Organized Village of Cake. President Jackson, good morning to you as well, and welcome back to our show.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me all right?
You sound great. You sound absolutely wonderful, President Jackson. I'd like to ask you to start off, just tell us about the cultural importance of the Tongas to your people.
Well, it's important, because it's our way of life. We depend on that old growth trees that are out there. And like President Jones said, our island has been heavily logged. So since logging has stopped, I don't know when it stopped, but our deer and moose and everything has started coming back. The reason why that's important is because we used to have to go across Frederick Sound to a place called Admiralty Island to hunt our deer. And we lost 3 young men. They went over and they're trying to come home, and their skiff capsized. So now that we have our deer coming back here, we don't have to go over there. We can hunt on our own island, on our own lands, and everybody gets the meat that they need for the coming winter, until the next year. So, food security is very important to us.
President Jackson, what are your thoughts with regard to economic opportunities or jobs or even more infrastructure there in the Tongass? Do you see any of those as potential benefits?
Not to my community. We had logging here with the Forest Service and our local Native Corporation, our regional Native Corporation. We all heavily logged on the island. At that time, we had 3 sawmill pulp mills, one in Sitka, Ketchikan, and Wrangell. So we have no infrastructure for any of that now, and plus to my community, most of the loggers and road builders are no longer in the industry because they aged out of it. And I don't know if you guys know this, but the younger generation, they're not looking at stuff like that anymore. They're looking for something where they can work and not have to destroy the environment.
Mm-hmm. President Jackson, what communications have you had with federal and state leaders about logging in the Tongass, and are they receptive in general to your conversations?
Well, I'll say they're receptive, but I don't think they listen. I talked to two Forest Service employees when I was in Juneau for this environmental meeting we had that Clinton Haida Tribal Council had put on up there last week. And, they asked me, what alternative are you guys interested in? And I said, are you still talking about those 6 alternatives that were put out originally when we were talking and then it was shut down? And they said, yeah. So just to put a little light on that, there's 6 alternatives. One is leave the Tongass roadless rule in place, and 6 was to open it up completely, and various stages in between. My stance when I went into it mainly to see what other people were talking about. But at the very beginning, I told them I'm here only to listen and only to let you know my position is alternative 1, which is leaving the roadless rule in place.
Mm-hmm. President Jackson, we talked earlier, the roadless rule has helped protect the Tongass for nearly 25 years, almost a quarter of a century. Going forward, in the event that the rule is not rescinded, what greater protection would you like to see in addition to the roadless rule? Is there more that could be done to protect the Tongass?
Yeah, I think we could work on, and that's what I was hoping we'd do the last time we went through this, is get it put into law where it would never be touched, permanent protection.
Permanent protection. Give us a call. We've got the phone lines open, 1-800-99-NATIVE. Also, 1-800-996-2848. That'll connect you here with our studio, and you can share your comments, share your insights on this issue that we're discussing here today on Native America Calling. We've got a break coming up here in just a short minute, but Cody Desautels, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation now. And again, thinking about some of these logging interests that are at stake, the potential for infrastructure, the potential for jobs. And again, we have listeners from all over the country, people who have maybe never even been to Alaska. Can you put a little more insight into what this issue might mean for logging interests across the entire United States and even parts of Canada for that matter?
Well, again, I think infrastructure is necessary if you're going to achieve your forest management goals, but you should make sure that your forest management goals match what the desires for the landscape are. So in the case of the Tongas, they don't have the same fire risk that we have in eastern Washington, so that should have a different management approach than very fire-prone ecosystems in the western U.S. But again, for using Cawville as the example, if we can't go thin stands, if we can't change species composition so that we have more fire-tolerant species on the landscape, we're going to continue to see these massive fires that we've seen. And at Cawville, we've burned 800,000 acres of a 1.4 million acre reservation in the last 10 years. And thankfully, not all of that has been high severity stand replacing fire, but that's because of the forest management, forest restoration, and fuels work that we've done in the previous 2 decades.
All right. Thank you, Cody.
We have to have infrastructure to do that.
Got it. We're going to take another short break. We're going to come back, and we've got another guest who's going to join the conversation, Gloria Burns, who is president of the Ketchikan Indian community. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
More than a museum, the Alaska Native Heritage Center represents all Alaska Native peoples in a living cultural center where the traditions, languages, and arts of Alaska Native peoples come to life through cultural programming and exhibitions. Life-size village sites, live performances, demonstrations, and dynamic exhibits are all just minutes from downtown Anchorage. Open 7 days a week, there is always something new to discover at the Alaska Native Heritage Center who support this show. More at alaskanative.net.
You're listening to Native America Calling. There's still time to join today's conversation about protections for U.S. Forest Service land and what that might mean for your tribal community. Join us by calling 1-800-996-2848. Joining us now from Ketchikan, Alaska is Gloria Burns. She is the president of the Ketchikan Indian community. Gloria, good morning and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Good morning. Good to be here with you.
It's great to have you on the show, President Burns. And I want to get your insights here. What are your concerns mostly about salmon and other wildlife habitat if timber harvesting is expanded in the Tongas now?
With the potential repeal of the roadless rule, I think there's timber and there's also mining to think about. But I want to say that as a child, I remember traveling by the sides of, like, you're on the ferry and you're looking up and whole expanses of completely clear-cut landscape. And what that felt like looking at it and knowing that a Native corporation that my grandmother belonged to was in charge of that kind of devastation and the havoc it wreaked on the creeks and streams. I come from generations of weavers. My mother makes her livelihood as a weaver of red and yellow cedar bark as well as spruce root. My grandmother, Dolores Churchill, did before she lost her eyesight, and my great-grandmother as well. So I come from generational people who require that our sister, the cedar tree, is taken care of in a good way. And so my concern is that, first of all, besides the land, and that we need the lungs of the Tongas, and that the reality is Indigenous people of Southeast Alaska, we are the Tongas, and they are us. Our spirits are not separated from each other. And so besides this physical manifestation of in which things are being destroyed and ecosystems are not able to survive in the way the Creator intended, we're also doing spiritual damage to ourselves. But for me, as a weaver, knowing that if we want generations of weavers to come after me in my family, there still has to be a Tongas to harvest cedar bark off of. I'm canoe people. I'm a Haida. We are canoe people, and we require old growth forest trees for our canoes and our stories. We require totem pole logs. If we continue down this path, there is not just a chance. The reality will be that we will never be able to carve another canoe from a cedar tree, that our totem poles will not exist. The portions, complete parts of our spirit will be gone. So, so for me, I just can't even imagine because I can't imagine. I remember seeing those trees, those clear cuts, and the devastation, the shame on people's faces when they look at it, the heartbreak. And then to know that we're proposing this as though there's some kind of economic ability. We have no pulp mills. We don't have any young people who want to be loggers that are interested in that. Very few. So we're going to import our folks that are going to do the work. Nobody's tooled up. And the native corporations aren't interested in investing large scale in that anymore. And those politicians that are will quickly find themselves replaced with politicians that aren't interested. But more than that is when I think about the implications to mining in Southeast Alaska, that's what I'm thinking about, because the federal government has not addressed the antiquated mining laws. And so when we put more roads through these places, these precious places in the Tongas, it will make them accessible to mining companies. And we have not addressed the fact that there are not appropriate laws around mining that are going to protect our streams.
Good point to make, President Burns. I want to go to the phones now, where we have Brandon, who is listening in Anchorage, Alaska, on radio station KNBA. Good morning, Brandon. Thanks for calling in today. You're on the air.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, what's your comment?
Well, I definitely have to agree with the woman who was just speaking and the gentleman before her. Alaska is a really special place. We are kind of the last frontier, and I liked her term lungs of the Tongas. Trees actually, give us air, and the taiga and the Tongas, all kinds of forests around the world. It's a fact that everywhere they clear cut is it changes the dynamics of the atmosphere in a very negative way, and it's really time to step back and look at our past too, and understand that this economic boom stuff is not going to save the world. We have to really conserve every tree that we can. I'm a local landscaper and I'm a tree nut, of course, but it's also trees create their own, environment. They create moisture. That's how we have all this moisture and the cool temperatures. They create our atmospheric air, which is really important. And the economic boom and the politicians and all that, they aren't here to understand the grandeur of this place and how mystical and magical it is. It's just papers being pushed around, and with Trump getting rid of forestry people too, it's kind of scary how they're just knocking down these little pegs to try to get into these natural resources that Alaska has. Even oil, it's time to just kind of stop emitting so much stuff, stop using so much and putting bad stuff in the air, and I mean, we have so much stone here. It's, maybe it's time to start building with stone. We have a lot of quarries. We've got stone all over Alaska. And maybe that's, they need to start building things out of stone instead of wood.
Okay. All right. Brandon, thank you for calling in there. Interesting insights there with regard to the possibility of using other types of construction materials other than wood. President Burns, I want to go back to you and listening to our caller, Brandon, talking about just some of the challenges that you and our other guests have already outlined. You mentioned the mining. That's something I think is really important that our listeners understand. But I also want to ask you about conversations that you've had with timber harvesters. And do they understand any of these issues that you and others are raising?
Well, I think people do. I think that there's a nostalgia, though, in Southeast Alaska for a time when it was booming the pulp mill. You know, the idea of having, you know, this industry, working with your hands and being able to move out of poverty through hard work. And I think as Indigenous people, we all understand the value of hard work and the power of, you know, creating change. And so you had a skill or you went and got educated. And so for the rest of the population, they see like this booming of the pulp industry as a time of all those, you know, all this goodness. But the reality is my father was a log truck driver, right? And he worked for SC Alaska. I don't know how many times he would sit at the log sorting yard because they had to pound in another road because they didn't do the, you know, the engineer didn't do it right. And so, so, you know, so he sat a lot of time sitting, and then I looked back, and for the longest time, you can look, a lot of the logging activities in Southeast Alaska were subsidized. So they weren't something that made a lot of money. There was a lot of subsidies by the federal government that happened. And so for me, I think, what kind of economics is it even bringing? And I forgot your question because I'm just so irritated at the idea of possibly seeing, because this is a fight my mom fought. So my mom sat on and did all these things to fight for the roadless rule not to be repealed under Bush. And so I grew up in this constant thing. And to know as an Indigenous person, as a Haida woman, that I'm gonna be fighting this fight this year, and then in 10 years, I'm gonna be fighting this fight again. I'm gonna be fighting this fight until I have no teeth, and then my niece or my nephew is gonna be fighting the fight. It's really very discouraging that we should have to fight all the time. So when President Jackson brought up the idea of permanent protections, Southeast tribes have gotten together, tribal leadership, elected tribal government leadership, and there were several of us went in on a homelands petition, this idea of acknowledging that these are our homelands and we have a unique relationship with the land and the forest, and it has a relationship with us, and the importance of codifying that in some kind of law, not just for us, but other Indigenous stewards who are next to, you know, the Tonga, their forests.
Okay.
And making sure that we're taking care of it so that we have all those things that we need, and that we can provide everything that our forest needs for us. These beautiful forests that are considered national treasures, they didn't come up from anywhere. They had Indigenous stewards and caretakers, people of the land, that grew up with them and made sure they were taken care of. And it's time. This is what I'm like. I'm not doing a call to action. I'm saying for me, every day I think about how important it is for me to advocate, to make sure that there is stewardship by Indigenous people on the lands that they grew up. And for us, that's the Tongas.
Okay. President Burns, I think you answered my question and then some, but I want to ask you one more question, and then I want to pivot back to President Jones. And my question, I mentioned this earlier, we have listeners from all over the country, people down here in the lower 48, and, you know, there's a housing crunch in this country. There are many cities, many communities where there just aren't enough homes, not enough affordable homes. And so many of us, myself included, we live in stick-built, timber-built homes. Lumber builds these houses. So I just want to ask you, I mean, the Tongass, it is the largest national forest in the country. Do you see any possibility that a compromise can be made over timber harvesting, given the vastness of this resource and the need for affordable building materials in the United States and elsewhere in the world?
Compromise, but you got to realize there's nowhere in Alaska that's taking care of that. So when we cut down our tree, we're sending it to China to be processed. So we're not sending it to Washington State. We're not sending it anywhere else. So you know, when you cut a tree down in Southeast Alaska, you cut down a tree and you got a tree. And there's nowhere that's processing it, except for these like little companies that are suddenly getting a lot of highlights, like Viking and everything, who are suddenly trying to gear up. So what does that look like? You're going to have to invest a lot of money into this area. But you know what? Maybe the solution is there are 5 landless communities who never received their settlement from the federal government regarding their land. Maybe that's a place where there's compromise. Maybe you talk to the corporations that have land and already have roads on their land and work something out with that. But the answer does not come from the Tongass National Forest, because I mean, does anybody really want to cut down a tree in the Tongass and send it to China to be processed? Because that's where it's at right now. So I think we have to understand the economy and the reality of the landscape of Southeast Alaska and where the work's going to actually be done. That's always been an issue, right? We don't have, you know, like if there's some kind of invest in small mills, if I'd say potentially you could do something, but in my opinion, would mean co-management with every tribe, because the tribes who lands they're on need to determine whether or not they're willing to trade a tree for somebody else's house versus their people being able to live and sustain themselves and get a deer in their land.
All right. Thank you, President Burns. And President Mike Jones in Kisan, Alaska, I want to go back to you because in addition to being the president of the organized village of Kisan, you are also your tribe's historian. So we've got about a minute and a half before we have to wrap up the show. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how the Tongass National Forest has been affected by logging in the past, going back more than 25 years, 50 years, 100 years.
Yeah, well, like Madam President Burns, I remember when the forests were whole, and then seeing the devastation of the forest and just the clear cut and how heartbreaking that was to witness that. And then I've also been here long enough to witness the second growth that comes up in just bunches of little toothpicks. They're very thin. They're not allowed to grow, to the size that they used to be. So I've experienced it firsthand, and I felt that. And I think there's a lot of alternatives to clear cutting. There's one thing that very few people talk about is hemp. And you can build a house out of hemp. You can look up Henry Ford's hemp car that he filled with hemp seed oil in 1952. So there's things, there's alternatives. You don't have to cut down our trees. You know, somebody, the caller from Anchorage mentioned the majesty and the of the trees, and to us, they are our cathedrals, our coliseums.
All right. Well, you heard it here on Native America Calling. Not just are we learning about challenges there in the Tongass, but also the hemp car designed by the Ford Motor Company in 1941, designed to use sustainable plant-based materials like soybeans, hemp, and flax. So with that, unfortunately, we're out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up this conversation. But I want to thank all of our guests who joined us today. President Mike Jones, President Joel Jackson, President Gloria Burns, Cody Desitel, and also Chuck Sams. And please don't forget to join us again tomorrow when we will look at new exhibits around the country that explore LGBTQ and Two-Spirit identity. Until then, I'm your host, Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Program support by the Colorado Plateau Foundation, a native-led foundation supporting native-led initiatives protecting lands, waters, and cultures of the plateau for generations to come. The Colorado Plateau Foundation helps to build networks, community, and organizational capacity. The Colorado Plateau Foundation is accepting grant proposals through September 5th. Eligibility information is available at coloradoplateaufoundation.org.
Support by AARP. Despite their service to our country, U.S. military vets, active duty service members, and their families are targeted by con artists significantly more than civilians and are 40% more likely to lose money than civilians. Vigilance is our number one weapon against fraud. You have the power to protect yourself. If an offer sounds too good to be true, it probably is. More at aarp.org/vetsfraudnetwork.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.